You might think that a man like John Wayne, the Duke himself, could never be shaken, that fear and doubt could never touch him. Yet there he was, facing something no stunt, no showdown, no script could prepare him for, the slow, relentless certainty of mortality. And in that impossible moment, the unexpected happened. It wasn't a doctor, it wasn't a family member, it wasn't some grand gesture of Hollywood fanfare. It was Dean Martin, the crooner whose life seemed effortless, who stepped into Wayne's world and spoke a truth that neither medicine nor bravado could provide. How could words, simple, calm, and sincere words, give courage to a man who had spent decades teaching the world how to be fearless? Wayne, accustomed to strength and control, found himself listening in disbelief, absorbing each phrase as if it were a secret weapon against his own fear. And yet, in that quiet acknowledgement of terror, in that unassuming, almost casual conversation, something remarkable happened. Vulnerability became power, and recognition of fear became a source of strength. What seems impossible, finding courage in someone else's voice, was happening right there in a living room between two men, one facing the end, the other quietly showing him the way to endure it. John Wayne wasn't just a man, he was an idea. For decades, he had embodied courage itself, a living symbol of the American frontier, a hero who never flinched, never wavered, never admitted weakness. To the world, the Duke was unshakable, a force of nature who could outdraw, outfight, and outlast anyone who challenged him. His face, his voice, his very presence carried authority, a promise that fear was something for lesser men. That image wasn't a costume or a role, it was a lifetime of expectation, a persona meticulously built and endlessly reinforced by every film, every photograph, every public appearance. People didn't see John Wayne the man, they saw the myth, and myths, by their nature, are supposed to be eternal, untouchable, impervious to doubt. But what happens when the myth encounters something no amount of grit or gunplay can conquer? When the invincible hero faces a reality that cannot be scripted, cannot be bargained with, cannot be tamed by bravado? That was the moment that made everyone around Wayne pause, unsettled, almost afraid themselves. Here was a man who had stood in the face of imaginary bullets and explosives, who had survived storylines of war and conquest, now confronted by something as unrelenting as time and as invisible as fear. Cancer, a relentless, silent opponent, was stripping away the certainty he had always carried, and with it exposed a vulnerability few had ever imagined. How could a man whose life was defined by control, toughness, and stoicism find himself trembling, unsure, and afraid? The contrast was stark, almost impossible to reconcile. The people who had revered him, who had modeled their own courage on his performances, now saw him in a light they had never anticipated, human, fragile, in need of comfort. And in that tension lay a quiet, almost imperceptible lesson. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it, even when the world expects you to be invincible. Wayne's fear wasn't just shocking, it was revolutionary in its honesty. It challenged every expectation, every assumption, every narrative that had been constructed around him. And yet, in that vulnerability, there was a doorway for connection, for authenticity, for the kind of courage that doesn't roar across silver screens, but whispers in quiet living rooms. That doorway was exactly where Dean Martin stepped in. Dean didn't arrive with scripts or applause. He arrived with words, with presence, with an understanding born of shared humanity. But before that, the world had to see just how extraordinary it was that John Wayne, the ultimate symbol of strength, could be shaken at all. And only when that contrast was clear, legend meeting mortality, myth meeting reality, did the true weight of what was about to happen become apparent. The stage was set, not for another performance, but a human connection that could transcend fear. And it began with a man who knew that even the strongest among us sometimes need someone to simply see them as they are. Dean Martin walked into John Wayne's world like a figure from an entirely different story. A man whose life had been defined by effortless charm, laughter, and the kind of celebrity cool that seemed unshakable. To the casual observer, Dean was a man who never worried, who glided through fame with a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, whose voice and demeanor suggested that nothing in life could rattle him. He had built a persona of ease, of sophistication, of humor as armor, and it was a stark contrast to Wayne's own legacy of discipline, stoicism, and uncompromising strength. On paper, the two men seemed incompatible. The Western hero who tamed the wild, the singer and comedian who tamed the stage. And yet, in that contrast lay the seed of something profound. Dean didn't enter Wayne's life with a mission or an agenda. He wasn't there to advise, to coach, or to perform heroics. He simply appeared, unpretentious and present, offering a mirror that reflected not the myth, but the man behind it. How could someone so seemingly frivolous understand a man who had carried the weight of invincibility for decades? That question hovered in the room, unspoken, as Dean crossed the threshold into Wayne's home for the first time. And the answer revealed itself quietly, without fanfare. Dean recognized the fear, the vulnerability, the human fragility that Wayne could not publicly acknowledge. He saw the man beneath the armor and treated him not as a legend, but as a person navigating an impossible moment. That recognition was revolutionary, and it landed in a way that nothing else could. Engineer of their interactions, Dean became the audience surrogate for anyone trying to understand Wayne in those final months. Through Dean, the world, through the viewer, could witness the private struggle of a man everyone assumed had no weaknesses. His laughter, his stories, his casual demeanor were not distractions, but vessels carrying empathy, understanding, and quiet strength. And this juxtaposition, the carefree entertainer beside the legendary hero, created tension, curiosity, and emotional resonance. How could words, pauses, and presence be stronger than steel, stronger than the bravado Wayne had wielded his entire life? Yet with Dean, they were. Every visit, every conversation chipped away at Wayne's isolation, revealing that courage could be shared, that strength could exist in vulnerability, and that fear could be held without judgment. Dean became a bridge between the public expectation of Wayne's heroism and the private reality of his humanity. And in doing so, he provided the perspective the audience longed for, a lens through which to witness greatness rendered human, invincible yet fallible, and ultimately profoundly relatable. The suspense, the tension, the contrast, all of it coalesced into an emotional anchor, demonstrating that the presence of someone who truly sees you can transform not just your final months, but your understanding of what it means to be alive, to be human, and to be brave in the face of the inevitable. When Dean Martin first sat across from John Wayne, there was no pretense, no agenda, no attempt to play the hero or the comedian. The room felt heavy with unspoken truths, a tension born from decades of public expectation and private fear. Wayne, who had spent a lifetime embodying courage on screen, had never allowed himself to be so exposed. And yet, in that moment, the vulnerability between them was palpable. Dean didn't break the silence with platitudes or empty reassurance. He simply spoke, and in his voice was an acknowledgement that Wayne had rarely, if ever, heard. This is really scary, isn't it? The question hung in the air, disarming in its simplicity, but devastatingly accurate. How could a man who had tamed the Wild West and battled every imaginable villain admit, even to himself, that fear had finally found him? That acknowledgement alone cracked the walls Wayne had built around himself, and for the first time he allowed the truth to settle in. Yes, he was afraid. That fear had been isolating, a secret burden that his public persona could not bear to reveal. Yet here it was, being recognized without judgment, without condescension. Dean understood that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to face it while knowing it existed. And he spoke from experience, not theory. His own losses, his own quiet battles, gave him credibility that no Hollywood script could imitate. Wayne's initial surprise at this recognition slowly transformed into trust. He realized that Dean's presence wasn't an intrusion or a performance. It was companionship in its purest form. What made this conversation extraordinary wasn't dramatic revelation or life-altering advice. It was its authenticity, the way it allowed two men, so different yet so alike in the weight of expectation, to sit with the truth of their humanity. They talked about mortality, yes, but also about legacy, about the meaning of courage when it can't be painted on a screen, about the strength found in admitting weakness. Each word, each pause, each glance reinforced that they could be honest without fear of judgment. And as the conversation drew to a close, an unspoken shift had occurred. Wayne felt lighter, not because the threat of illness had diminished, but because he no longer carried it alone. Dean had created a space where fear could exist without shame, where vulnerability was not a flaw, but a bridge. It was the first step in a friendship that would carry Wayne through the most difficult months of his life. The open loop remained, of course. How would this relationship evolve, and what further strength could it provide? But in that first conversation, the foundation was laid. Empathy over bravado, presence over advice, humanity over legend. It was the quiet power of being seen, truly seen, that began to transform Wayne's final journey. And it was a lesson that resonates far beyond the confines of celebrity or circumstance, that strength is often found not in hiding fear, but in sharing it with someone who understands, someone who doesn't need to fix it, and someone who, by simply being there, allows courage to bloom in the spaces left by uncertainty.
Over the following weeks, Dean Martin's presence became a quiet force in John Wayne's life, a steady rhythm against the chaos of fear and illness. It wasn't flashy gestures or grand speeches that changed anything. It was the consistency, the small moments that accumulated into profound reassurance. When Wayne woke to another day clouded by pain and uncertainty, Dean would be there, not to lecture, not to inspire with cliches, but simply to exist alongside him. How often do we underestimate the power of presence, the way a calm voice or a shared silence can anchor someone through the storm? Wayne, who had spent decades embodying indomitable strength, began to recognize that vulnerability didn't erase courage, it revealed it. The conversations they shared were layered, shifting from practical matters to reflections on legacy, from the anxieties of leaving loved ones behind to memories of lives fully lived. Each insight Dean offered wasn't a prescription, but a mirror, reflecting back to Wayne the bravery he had always carried inside. Slowly, the transformation became visible, not in dramatic gestures, but in Wayne's softened eyes, the way his shoulders released some of the tension they had carried for decades. Friends and family noticed it too, the subtle shift from a man bracing against mortality to a man allowing life to fill his final months. How does one measure the strength found in being seen and heard when fear is real? Dean's words were simple, yet they carried weight because they acknowledged truth without judgment. It's okay to be afraid, he reminded Wayne, and in hearing that, Wayne felt permission to live honestly in each moment. The impact extended beyond mere comfort. It reshaped behavior, influencing how Wayne interacted with his family, how he faced treatments, how he approached the fragile balance of hope and acceptance. This was the slow, accumulative power of empathy paired with wisdom, an influence invisible to many, but transformative to the one who needed it most. And as the weeks passed, Wayne began to mirror that strength outwardly, sharing moments of laughter, candid confessions, and tenderness that had previously seemed impossible under the weight of expectation. Dean's guidance didn't remove the fear, but it reframed it, turning vulnerability into a source of dignity. Social proof emerged quietly. The family observed how one man's authenticity allowed another, even a legend, to confront life's most formidable adversary without losing composure or humanity. Was this transformation dramatic or sudden? No, it was incremental, like a tide reshaping the shoreline, persistent, patient, unstoppable in its subtlety. And therein lies the lesson that transcends celebrity. True courage is rarely about defeating what terrifies us. It's about engaging it fully, with companionship, honesty, and compassion, until fear becomes a companion rather than a captor. By the time Wayne faced his final days, the change was undeniable. Dean's words, his presence, and his unwavering acknowledgement of the human condition had guided a man who had always seemed invincible into a state of peace. The transformation was quiet, profound, and lasting, proving that sometimes strength is not forged in action, but in the shared recognition of our shared fragility and the courage to meet it together. As John Wayne's illness progressed, the world outside grew smaller, and the stakes of every interaction sharpened. The cameras, the lights, the legends, they all faded into background noise. In that narrowing horizon, Dean Martin's visits became more than companionship. They were a lifeline. Was it the food he brought, the small practicalities he handled, or the quiet presence that mattered most? Perhaps it was all of it together, a constellation of care that made Wayne feel both seen and supported without compromise to his dignity. Each afternoon, Dean would arrive with the understanding that nothing needed to be spoken aloud unless it truly mattered. The actor who had faced outlaws, wars, and untamed landscapes now faced a fear he could not negotiate with charm or bravado. And Dean's presence created a paradoxical plum, a space where mortality was acknowledged without panic, where vulnerability was met with acceptance rather than pity. Could one man's calm genuinely anchor another in the eye of such a storm? For Wayne it did. He began to allow himself moments of openness, telling stories of regret and joy, of triumphs and failures, and watching his family respond to the real John Wayne rather than the myth. Dean never dictated how these moments should unfold. He simply provided the framework for honesty and authenticity. The impact was subtle, but cumulative.
Wayne's family witnessed a remarkable shift. He laughed more readily. He asked for help without defensiveness. He expressed affection that had often been constrained by pride or expectation. In practical terms, Dean managed correspondence, coordinated minor arrangements, and ensured Wayne didn't face the logistics of illness alone. But the deeper influence was emotional. The Duke, who had built an entire life around the perception of invincibility, now felt permitted to be human. It was a transformation that carried authority in its quietness, a legend learning that courage is not absence of fear, but the choice to face it with support, with honesty, and with love. There was a rhythm to these final weeks, punctuated by laughter, reflection, and shared understanding. Could such simplicity hold profound weight? Every gesture reinforced that it could. Social proof emerged naturally. Family and friends saw how Wayne's demeanor shifted, not because he was cured, not because he had achieved some last triumph, but because he was supported in a way that honored both his humanity and his legacy. Even in moments of weakness, Dean's presence validated Wayne's choices, his fears, and his life's narrative. The contrast was stark, a man once defined by cinematic heroics, now revealing the quiet heroism of vulnerability, guided by a friend whose influence was gentle yet undeniable. In those last days, the lessons crystallized. Strength is often forged not in isolation or spectacle, but in the trust to let another human share your burden, to allow presence, empathy, and authenticity to shape the final chapters. When Wayne's time finally came, he faced it with a dignity that reflected both his own resilience and the profound effect of Dean's companionship. The world remembered the legend, but those quiet afternoons revealed the essence of true courage. It is human, relational, and quietly transformative. Dean's unwavering support ensured that even in the shadow of death, Wayne's final weeks were marked not by fear alone, but by connection, affirmation, and the subtle but undeniable power of one person helping another navigate the uncharted territory of mortality. What can we truly take from the friendship between Dean Martin and John Wayne? Beyond the anecdotes, beyond the fame and the public images, there lies a lesson that transcends Hollywood and speaks to the human experience. Life often demands strength, but it is not measured in heroic deeds or in the accolades we collect. It is measured in our ability to be real with each other, to allow someone else into the quiet corners of our fears. How often do we hide our vulnerability because the world expects us to be invincible or because we fear burdening others? Wayne and Dean remind us that the bravest act is not the one performed for applause, but the one shared in honesty and trust. The enduring power of connection is subtle yet transformative. Dean's visits, his willingness to sit without pretension, to listen without judgment, provided Wayne with something no medicine, no therapy, no accolade could offer. Reassurance that being human is enough, that fear does not diminish value, that vulnerability can coexist with dignity. Can this idea be applied beyond the walls of a home or the shadows of a terminal illness? Absolutely. In workplaces, in families, in friendships, moments of genuine presence and understanding create ripples that endure far longer than any superficial show of strength. The story also challenges the narratives we tell ourselves about courage. We often equate toughness with stoicism, with the suppression of emotion, with the ability to endure without support. Yet here, in the final months of a legend, courage was redefined. It was sitting with fear, naming it aloud, and allowing a trusted companion to share the weight. In this space, real strength emerged, not from denial, but from mutual recognition of fragility and from the willingness to lean into discomfort together. What Wayne and Dean achieved was not miraculous in the conventional sense, but it was profoundly human. It reminds us that the most impactful lessons are rarely found in victory or achievement. They are found in presence, empathy, and the quiet acts that make another person feel less alone. And perhaps that is the ultimate legacy, the understanding that our connections, the time we invest in seeing and supporting others, define the value of our lives more than any accolade or title ever could. As we reflect on their story, we see that vulnerability is not weakness and support is not charity. Both are expressions of courage and shared humanity. The image of Wayne, once the unassailable Duke, finding peace in the presence of Dean, offers a template for living with authenticity. Show up for others, honor the fears that dwell within, and recognize that sometimes the greatest strength is simply to be there. This is a lesson that extends far beyond Hollywood, far beyond mortality. It touches anyone who has faced uncertainty, anyone who has wondered if fear is a flaw, anyone who has discovered that human connection can be a quiet, unshakable power. In the end, the friendship of Dean and Wayne teaches us that the deepest courage comes not from hiding our struggles, but from allowing someone else to walk beside us through them, transforming our final moments, and perhaps all moments, into something profoundly, enduringly human.